This is the second part of PL SQL triggers. In this we will discuss that what are the different type of triggers, how the trigger can be created, and we understand the different triggers with some examples. Now first type of triggers is statement level triggers. Statement level triggers means that these triggers are executed once for all rows in the transaction or statement affecting a set of records in a table. So that means that if you are doing an activity like update or delete, and if it is affecting more than one rows in a table, then a statement level trigger will execute once for all those rows. For an update, insert or delete statement that affects multiple records in a table, the commands specified in the statement level triggers are executed for all rows. Statement level triggers are default type of triggers when a create trigger statement is executed without the specifying the type of trigger. So when you don't specify that whether it is a row level trigger, then automatically the trigger is considered as that of the statement level, and whatever activity you have defined in the trigger, that will be done for all the affected rows in one shot. Next type of triggers are row level triggers. These are executed for each row in the transaction or statement affecting a set of records. For an insert, update or delete statement that affects multiple records in a table, the commands specified in the row level triggers are executed for each row. So if you are suppose doing the update or delete action on some rows in the table, and you have defined certain activities in the trigger, then those activities defined in the trigger will be executed once for every row. It will not be done in one shot, but if there are 10 rows which are being affected, then the trigger statements will be executed 10 times for once for each row. It is created by specifying for each row in the create trigger statement for trigger definition. So if you want to create a row level trigger, then in the trigger definition you have to specify for each row. We will just discuss this in the syntax of the create trigger statement. Then next type of triggers are before, after and instead of triggers. Before trigger, these triggers are executed before the insert, update or delete events. Whenever you apply a trigger on a table and you perform the insert, update or delete activities on the table, then if the trigger is of the type before, then the statements which are given in the trigger, they are executed before the insert, update or delete activity takes place. It is used when the trigger action must be executed before the triggering statement is allowed to complete. That means before inserting, if you want to do something, then you have to write in the before trigger. Then second type is after trigger. These triggers are executed after the insert, update or delete events. So when you complete the insert, update or delete activity, then whatever you have written in the trigger, that will be executed after completion of the triggering event. That means either insert, update or delete. It is used when the trigger action must complete after the trigger event. So whatever you want to do when the triggering event completes, that you have to write in an after trigger. Last one is instead of trigger. This trigger fires instead of the triggering event. It can be applied to views only. So suppose in a trigger which you have defined as instead of insert, that trigger will be executed when update or delete is taking place, but when insert is taking place, then that trigger will not be fired. So instead of defines that which activity you have to escape, but this thing is applied only to a view. Trigger is created by using the create statement, and we will discuss the syntax one line at a time. So here you have to give create or replace trigger, and after you have to give the name of the trigger that you want to create. Create or replace. Or replace is optional, but if you are suppose having the same trigger previously in your database and you want to give a new definition to the same trigger, then if you create trigger, you don't give the or replace part, then your trigger will not be created. Oracle will give you an error that this trigger is already existing. But if you give or replace, if the existing definition of the trigger will be replaced by the new definition. Then you have to give before or after. Before or after, only one thing you can give, either before or after. Then you give the triggering event. Now there are 3 triggering events: insert, update and delete. So you can give all of them with or keyword, or you can give any one which you want to implement the trigger for. On, then you give the table name, and if you want to create the trigger as for each row, then you have to give for each row. This will make the row level trigger. Then next line is follows another trigger. Suppose in a table you have multiple triggers and you want the triggering event to be in a particular sequence, then whatever trigger this trigger is going to follow, its name you can give after the keyword follows. It is also optional. Then enable or disable. Now by default the trigger is enabled. Enabled means that when you create a trigger, it will be available for execution. But there can be certain times when you want to disable the trigger, maybe for some maybe to allow certain actions to take place on the table. So you don't want to drop the trigger, you just want to disable it. Then you can use this particular keyword here after the follows, and by default the trigger is enabled. Then next is, this is also optional, when condition. In when condition you want to give a condition that when this trigger is going to execute. Trigger is always going to be executed when some event takes place, but if you want to add another condition with the trigger, that on what particular condition this trigger will work, then you can give it here. Suppose update a table and you want to update a column on the basis of the salary of the employees, and whoever are getting salary more than 15,000, for them you want to execute this trigger, then you have to give that condition in when. Then after that you have the declare, and in declare portion you give the variables that you want to use in this trigger. Then in the begin part you can give what this trigger should execute, what are the things that this trigger is going to do, and in the exception part you have to give the exception handling statements, that if in while executing this trigger, if some exceptions occur, then what should happen. And last is the end keyword. So you can see here from here that trigger is nothing but it is a block of statements, but this block of statement is of special type, that it is a trigger, and it can be executed only when some event occurs like insert, delete or update. So it will not be executed by you explicitly. If you want to explicitly execute a trigger, that cannot be done. The trigger can be executed only when that event occurs. That means you define a trigger, when that event will occur on the related table, then only this trigger will be executed. So this is the syntax of the trigger. Now here are certain bind variables which are related to triggers, and these are two bind variables, old and new. As you can understand from the names, that old bind variable will store the old values before the event, and new bind variable will store the values after that the DML statement executes. So the triggering events are the insert, update and delete, and with insert, the old bind variable, it will be containing null for all the column values, because before inserting no older values are available. And for the insert event, the new bind variable will represent values given in the insert statement which have to be inserted in the table. So whenever you give an insert statement, you always pass on the values which you want to insert in against the columns. So the new bind variable, it will store those values which you have given in the insert statement. The next event is update. For this, both old and new bind variables will be available. Update statement, as you remember, that it updates some values in the columns which you have specified in your update statement. So old bind variable will represent the old values before updation, and new bind variable will represent the values which will be there after the update statement. And in the delete event, the old bind variable will store the values which are there before the row is deleted, and new bind variable will contain all null values, because after deletion the row is eliminated, and so no new values will be available. Then the trigger predicates. Trigger predicates means on the basis of these values you can define certain actions in the trigger block. So these are the three trigger predicates that can be used to determine if a trigger is responding to a specific DML statement. These trigger predicates are inserting, updating and deleting. If you have given the insert statement on the table, then inserting predicate will have the true value. If you have given the update statement on the table, then updating trigger will store the true value. If you have given a delete statement on the table, then deleting predicate will store the true value. These predicates return true if the triggering statement is of the type specified, otherwise they return false. So whatever activity you have specified on the table using the DML statement, according to that these trigger predicates will store the true value, otherwise they will store the false values. So now we are going to discuss certain triggers with the help of some examples, and the tables which are used in these examples are: first is the attendance, and here the structure is instructor ID, then course ID, then lecture date, then student ID and the attendance. The attendance is given as P if the student is present, and attendance is given A if the student is absent. Then second table is ATT_log, and username log timestamp TS, then table name of the table on which this activity is taking place, and then action, what action has been done, that is whether insertion is done, deletion is done or updation is done. So what I will be doing in this example is I will be performing the action on the attendance table, and I will attach some triggers with the attendance table, and those triggers will fill the data in the ATT_log table. And another table which I have created here is imp age. So this imp age, this table will be used to explain the before triggers, and attendance and at log, it will be used for explaining the working of after triggers. So let us begin with the examples. So this is an example of before trigger. What I am doing in this example is whenever the imp age, this table will be inserted or updated the date of birth, then the age of the person will be automatically calculated. The working of this trigger is like this. First line, create or replace trigger trig_age, this is the name of the trigger. Then it will be executed before insert or update of date of birth on imp age. Imp age is the name of the table, date of birth is the column, and I want that whenever insertion or updation of date of birth column takes place in the imp age table, then for each row this activity will be done. This is an example of a row level trigger because I have added here for each row, and this is a very simple trigger. What I am doing here is that I am calculating the age of the person. So as you remember that in age we had just 3 columns, e-name, date of birth and age. So here the age is calculated because I am inserting only the name and date of birth. Using the date of birth I will be calculating the age. So how it is calculated, I am using here the bind variable new colon new dot age is equal to months between sysdate comma colon age new date of birth. So colon new, this is a bind variable, so it will contain the date of birth. So date of birth, using the date of birth and sysdate, the months between is calculated, it is divided by 12, and the whole value that we get, it will be rounded off at 1 decimal place, and that will be stored into the age column. So insertion is just of the name and date of birth, but calculation of the age is by using the trigger. So as you can see here that in this table I have given these insert statements. These are the 7 insert statements where I am inserting the names of people and their date of birth, and after before insertion after the insert statement you can see that names are stored, date of births are stored, and just because I have defined the trigger for calculating the age is calculated automatically. I haven't given the age in these insert commands. So since the insert command is executed on the imp age table and a trigger is defined, so that trigger will be fired, and in the statement where I'm calculating colon new age, that age will be calculated and it will be updated here. And next is when I make some update statement. So since this is a row level trigger, so the updation will be done for every row that satisfies the update statements. So here I'm doing the update statement on just 3 rows where the names is Bobby, Annie and Jerry. As you can see that Bobby has a date of birth 19 January 91, so here the date is changed. Annie has 9th May 98, her date is also changed here, and Jerry has date in the table as 17th March and it is also changed here. So after the update statements, this is the snapshot of the table. You can see that only for Anne and Bobby and Jerry the date of births are updated and their ages are recalculated. You can see here that the update statement is only for date of birth, and since the trigger is defined for insert and or update, so when the update statement is executed and it is a row level trigger, so again the data, as soon as the date of birth is updated, because of the trigger the age is recalculated and it is stored in the corresponding table by updating the existing value. So this is about the before trigger. Now before trigger can also be used for triggering some activity on the database. it can be very common that you want your users to inhibit from doing activity on a certain day or after a certain time of the day. So you can write a trigger for that table where you want to inhibit such activity. Here I am using the attendance table that I discussed in the previous slide, and here the trigger is like create or replace trigger, inhibit trigger before insert or update or delete. That means if whenever the insert, update or delete activity is taking place on attendance, before that I want to run this trigger. In this trigger I have declared one variable v_weekday, which will store the current week, means that what weekday is today. So that will be used by the statement v_weekday is equal to rtrim 2char sysdate comma day. 2char, as you remember, that it is a inbuilt function which returns us the date in characters according to the second argument. So here I want to have the day of the week for this particular date. So whenever this code will be executed, system will check on the date of that particular system and it will return that what weekday is this, and that weekday is stored in v_weekday. If v_weekday is in Wednesday or Saturday, that means if the weekday is Wednesday or Saturday, then you don't want the teacher or the instructor to update the attendance. So what you do here is you raise the application error. Now this is an inbuilt exception, so you raise the application error minus 20,000 and you give the message attendance can't be modified or updated on Saturday or Wednesday, and endif and then end. And when I try to insert or update or delete data from attendance table on Wednesday or Saturday, then I got this message that attendance can't be added or modified on Saturday or Wednesday. So this is how you can inhibit activity, and when the application error is raised, then the insert, update or delete statement will not be executed because we are doing this before these activities. So whenever the raise application error is raised, then the application will not run. It will stop the user from inserting, updating or deleting any value on attendance on Saturdays or Wednesdays. Now we begin with the examples of after trigger and after trigger insert. Now here you can see that in line number 1 the name of the trigger is AATT trigger, and it is after insert or update or delete on attendance. So the table name is attendance. So whenever insert, update or delete is done on attendance table, then this trigger will be executed, but after completing insert, delete or update statement. So what I am actually doing here is that I am maintaining a log information in ATT_log table, which is given at the line number 12, that which user at what time on what table which activity he has done. So that thing will be stored by running this trigger after the insertion, updation or deletion. So in line number 4 and 5 I have declared v table. The name of the table is attendance. It is stored here because this particular trigger will be executed on attendance table. So for the table name I am storing attendance in the line number 4. Act will be what activity is done by the user. So act will be taking value from 7 to 11 line. So depending upon whether I am doing updating operation, insertion or deletion, the act will store these values, and here I have used the case statement. So 7 says case and 8 line when updating. Now you remember updating is the predicate for the trigger. So whenever the updation event is going to be done, then updating will return me true. So when updating is true, then act will store update. When inserting is true, then act will store insert, and when deleting is done, then act will store delete. And in line number 12 you can see that I am inserting into ATT_log values User is a system value which will identify the user who is actually right now doing some transactions in the database. So that username will be automatically taken by user in the user system value. Then timestamp, sys timestamp, it is again a system defined value which will take the values in that what date, what time this activity is happening. So this will be automatically taken. And then v underscore tbl, this will be taken as from line number 4, which is the attendance table, and act from line number 8 to 10. If inserting, then insert, if deleting, then delete, if updating, then update, and that value will be inserted here. Now these are the insert operations that I have done in the attendance table, and since trigger is defined, so inserting will be when inserting is true, so this is the data I get in the attendance table. All these 6 insert commands, they have updated the values in insert table like this, and corresponding to the ATT table, the log information is maintained like this. Username is apex public user, because I use this in live SQL and live SQL online system, so the username is taken as this value. And log underscore ts, this is a timestamp when this activity is done, then the name of the table, then action, whether insertion is done, deletion is done, or updating is done. So that means for the 6 insert statements, the data is inserted into the attendance table first, and later on, after the insertion operation, the ATT underscore log table is filled with this information, that which user at what time on which table has done which activity. Then update operation in the table attendance. So here are the activities that I have done in update. Here I have for student ID 301, 303 and 306, I want to update their attendance as absent. So all, since when I use live SQL, all these activities were executed in one shot, so they are taken as one single transaction. So you can see that 301, 303 and 306 are updated with absent value, and in the log table the last row is inserted where it is defined that the user has done the update operation on table attendance at this time and this date. And similarly, delete operation in the table attendance, these are the delete operations I have done. 2 delete commands, these are done separately, so there will be 2 transactions for it. Delete for 301 and 306, this is the table where I have deleted the 301 and 306 rows, and this is how the log will be updated. You can see the insertion is taking place in the log table because of the trigger. So trigger is executed when delete, update or insert is executed, and you can see that the delete operation has added these 2 things in the table for the logging information, that this user has deleted rows from attendance table at this date and this time. So next is limitations of triggers. You cannot add commit, rollback or save point statements in triggers. Then trigger body, it cannot exceed 32k in size. You have to keep the triggers short. No limit on the number of triggers defined for a DML statement for a table. You can add as many as number of triggers for a table as you want or as you require. 2 triggers of same type for a table can be defined. When this occurs, the triggers of same type fire sequentially. That means if you want to add 2 insert triggers on a table, both of them can be added and they will be executed in the sequential order. So these are the things that you have to take care when defining triggers. Then next is enabling and disabling triggers. The triggers can be enabled or disabled. Sometimes you don't want to delete the trigger, so what you can do is, but you still want some activity to be done which are inhibited by the trigger, so you can simply disable the trigger. By default, triggers are enabled. It can be disabled or enabled with alter trigger statement. So if you remember that alter statements are for making the changes into the database, so alter trigger can be used for disabling or enabling the triggers. A disabled trigger does not execute the trigger body even if the triggering statement is issued. For example, if suppose you have created an insert trigger and the trigger is stopping your user from inserting a specific value, you want to insert those values, so instead of deleting the trigger you can disable the trigger. So in that case the trigger will be stopped only and you will be able to insert those values which the trigger prevents. So the syntax for enabling and disabling triggers is, you can define it with the alter table command or alter trigger command. So if you want to disable the trigger individually, that means if suppose on a table you have 5 triggers and you want to disable only one trigger, then you can give the alter trigger command. But if you have a table where you want to disable all the 5 triggers, then you can give one single alter table command and to disable all the triggers. So the first statement is disabling the trigger individually, so you have to give alter trigger, these are the keywords, the name of the trigger and then the disable keyword. Then if you want to disable all the triggers, then alter table name, disable all triggers. So this will disable all the triggers which are available on the table. If you want to enable a trigger, the same thing, you have to give an alter trigger name and enable. If you want to enable all the triggers associated with the table, you have to give alter table name and enable all triggers. Enable all triggers, these are the keywords. So last thing is dropping a trigger. Dropping a trigger is just like dropping a table, so you can use the drop trigger statements and it drops a trigger permanently from the database. When a table is dropped with drop table statement, all its associated table triggers are also dropped. So you don't have to drop triggers individually when you are dropping the table. When you give a drop table command, all the related triggers will be automatically dropped. But if you want to delete a specific trigger for that specific table, then you have to use the drop trigger command. The syntax is drop trigger and trigger name.